Well, welcome back to the No Neutral Moments podcast. It's great to be with you. By the time you're watching this video, we will have probably all celebrated July 4th and the 250th birthday of this amazing nation that we live in. But part of being a part of this amazing nation is some of the frustrations that have come with why I've written this recent book, and many of you have purchased. And we feel the need to continually get the word out. I think we have a nation that is still increasingly divided by the extremes. That's why we wrote the book, The Middle, How the Quiet Majority Can Mend the Divided Nation. See if I can get that where you can see it. Hope you're picking up copies anywhere you buy books. There's the audio book available as well. I had the privilege of reading that, and whether you want to read the hardback or pick up the audio, we hope you will. But the conviction with which I wrote the book was because of both in the church world and in the political world, it just has become apparent that this party spirit is bringing us to a place where we're just being torn apart. And you've seen it in recent elections in New York. We saw it in recent elections in Colorado. We're seeing it all over. We're acting surprised because we now have Marxist and socialist and communist candidates being elected for possible positions in various areas of government. Then we have the right, who has several issues that we're dealing with as well. And I still believe in the middle. And I know there's a lot of people out there who think, well, the middle is mushy. No, I think the middle is made up of the majority that actually rejects the extreme party spirit. And quite frankly, and what I'll spend a little bit of time on this episode talking about from the book, is a caution that came directly from our founding fathers. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to read from part of my book about what some of our founding fathers said, because it seems very appropriate as we're in this season of celebrating the 250th anniversary or birthday of our great country. But I literally am going to read this to you. Hamilton and Madison, during the debates in Philadelphia, noted that the Constitution's spirit of moderation contrasted with the intolerant spirit of those who are ever so much persuaded of their being in the right in any controversy. In other words, this whole spirit of moderation was gone, and people were intolerant of other people's viewpoints. Adams, the first U.S. president or vice president, and then the second president, said, without the great political virtues of humility, patience, and moderation, every man in power becomes a ravenous beast of prey. And then Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, writes years later, men by their constitutions are naturally divided into two parties, which means sometimes we have to act against our nature and get into our better nature. Washington was a fan, we mentioned this in the book, of an essayist named Joseph Addison. Addison wrote some words in a piece called The Malice of Parties when he said, there cannot a greater judgment befall the country than a dreadful spirit of division as rends a government into two distinct people and makes them greater strangers and more averse to one another. I hope you heard that. It rends us into two extremes, and then we are more averse to one another than if there were actually two different nations. It feels like we're two different nations, not one nation under God. Addison goes on to say, this influence is very fatal both to men's morals and to their understandings. It sinks the virtue of a nation, and not only so, but destroys even common sense. In Washington's farewell address, September 17th, 1796, he warned Americans of the baneful effects of the spirit of party. Generally, this spirit, Washington continues, says, unfortunately is inseparable from our nature, having roots in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different stages in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed. But in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. All of these talking about how we can tear ourselves apart by extremes. One of my favorite authors of all times, my favorite book of all time, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. In his book, The Third Alternative, listen to what he wrote. The 20th century was an age of impersonal war, but the 21st century seems like an age of personal malice. The rage thermometer is way up. Families quarrel, coworkers contend, cyberbullies terrorize, courts are jammed, and fanatics murder the innocent. Contemptuous commentators swamp the media. The more outrageous the attack, the more money they make. The rising fever of contention can make us ill. That's why we wrote this book. I talk about in the first part of this book how we got here. And then the second half of the book, what are some things that we can do to, you might say, mend this nation, revive this nation, return this nation, because we're being shredded. And it's the extremes on both sides. I'll leave you with one more thing. It was a TED Talk in December of 2010. It was entitled Take the Other Person to Lunch by Elizabeth Lesser. And this is what she said. She goes, I'm deeply disturbed by the ways in which all of our cultures are demonizing the other, by the voice we're giving to the most divisive among us. Lesser goes on to say, the worst eras in human history start like this. They start with negative, and I love her word, otherizing, and then they morph into violent extremism. In other words, as we talk about in the book, we forget our common humanity. I'm not saying there's not good and evil. Please stop acting like I'm saying something like that. There is good and evil, but we otherize people before we even understand people or know people or have a conversation with them. Lesser argued that negative otherizing is how genocide started in Europe at the hands of the Nazis, in Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot, and in Rwanda, where some 800,000 members of the Tutsi ethnic group were slaughtered by ethnic Hutu extremists. I think it's very important we listen to the voices of our founders. We listen to the voices of people like Covey, to the voices of Lesser, and we say, hey, we got to wake up here because the extremes are shredding us. And anybody who doesn't identify with an extreme is somehow called mushy or doesn't have convictions. And I think people in the middle actually have greater convictions, but we've got to rise up and use our voices. I actually conclude this chapter with this statement: a lack of honor and respect for our common humanity and an unwillingness to stand united as Americans. This type of divide is what brought us to the Civil War. It divided between the North and the South in the 1860s and serves as a case study on what happens when we otherize and objectify those with whom we disagree. We are free to disagree, but we have come to a point where we no longer can disagree with respect. We automatically assume that to disagree, we must disrespect. We actually begin with disrespect before we even know who we're disagreeing with. We've lost our compass. We've lost our morals. We're divided by the extremes in Washington. We're divided by the extremes in state capitals and even in some cases in city capitals. And it's time for us to step back and realize if we really are one nation under God, indivisible with liberty and justice for all, then somehow we've got to back up and start seeing each other differently. It doesn't mean we don't have strong disagreements, but we've got to stop otherizing people. We have to stop demonizing people and work through our issues with people rather than going through people with our issues. I'm so excited for your support. Thank you for all of you out there who have already bought copies of the book. I hope we can do what my publisher said when we started this process, and that is start a movement and wake people up. Heard a tragic statistic this morning about elections. We wonder why the extremes are taking control, and a lot of it is because in certain places and in some significant states, almost 70+% of registered voters are not voting in local and state elections. In this season, where we're celebrating this amazing country's 250th birthday with the rights and privileges we enjoy, if we neglect the right to vote, then we have no right to complain. And it's time for the majority middle to step up, quit being apathetic, and step in and start demonstrating a life and a character and respect that'll mend this divided nation. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you the next time. God bless.